She cheated, then moved her new boyfriend into our apartment while I was on a work trip, saying, "We can all be adults about this." I replied, "Okay." I then called our landlord and invoked the unauthorized tenant clause in the lease that only I had signed. She discovered what being an adult meant when they both received a 48-hour eviction notice. I, 32M, had been with my girlfriend for 4 years when everything fell apart. We'd been living together for the past 2, splitting expenses down the middle even though the lease was solely in my name. She'd moved in after her previous roommate situation imploded, and I'd been happy to have her. The apartment was nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom in a decent neighborhood with parking included, but it was ours. Or so I thought. My job in industrial equipment sales required occasional travel, usually a week at most. This particular trip was to oversee a major installation project in Nevada, and I'd be gone for 10 days. She seemed fine with it when I left. We talked about maybe grabbing dinner at our favorite Thai place when I got back, and she'd kissed me goodbye at the door like always. The first sign something was wrong came on day 6. I tried video calling her that evening after wrapping up at the site, but she declined. She sent a text saying she was tired and going to bed early. Fair enough, it was nearly 11 her time. But when I called the next day during my lunch break, she declined again. This time the excuse was that she was out with friends and the connection was bad. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, but pushed it aside. I had 3 more days of work ahead, and I needed to focus. On day 8, I called my buddy who lived in the same complex. We'd been friends since college, and his unit was just 2 buildings over. I asked him casually if he'd seen my girlfriend around, maybe checking if she seemed all right. There was a pause on the line that lasted too long. He asked if we'd broken up. My blood went cold. I told him no, and asked why he would think that. He hemmed and hawed before finally admitting he'd seen her with some guy multiple times over the past week. They'd been going into my apartment together, laughing, acting couple-like. He'd assumed we'd split, and she'd moved on quickly. I thanked him and hung up. My hands were shaking. I went through my phone and pulled up our security camera app. I'd installed a simple camera in the living room months ago after a string of package thefts in the complex. She knew about it. We'd both checked it from our phones before. I opened the feed and scrolled back through the recordings. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was my girlfriend on my couch with a guy I'd never seen before. They were watching TV, his arm around her shoulders. I scrolled further. They were cooking together in my kitchen. Further still, they were kissing. The timestamps showed this had been going on since day 2 of my trip. He'd essentially moved in the moment I left town. I sat in my hotel room that night staring at the ceiling, processing everything. Part of me wanted to call her immediately and unload, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the cold calculation that was starting to form in my mind. I'd been the one who'd handled the lease, the utilities, everything official. Her name wasn't on any of it. She'd just transferred me money each month for her half. The next morning, I forced myself through the workday on autopilot. That evening, I called the landlord. He was an older guy, straightforward and business-minded. We'd always had a good relationship. I paid on time, didn't cause problems, kept the place maintained. I told him I needed to discuss something sensitive regarding my lease. He listened as I explained the situation. I kept it factual and unemotional. My girlfriend had moved someone into the apartment without my knowledge or consent while I was traveling for work. I referenced the clause in our lease agreement about unauthorized tenants. I'd read that lease thoroughly before signing, and I remembered that specific section. Any additional occupant staying more than 5 consecutive days required written approval from the landlord. Neither of them had that approval. The landlord was quiet for a moment, then asked if I was certain about what I was telling him. I confirmed I had video evidence. He sighed and said he'd have to enforce the lease terms. He'd need to issue formal notice to vacate to any unauthorized occupants. I asked how long that process would take. He said given the clear violation, he could issue a 48-hour notice. After that, if they weren't gone, he could pursue formal eviction and potentially hold me liable for breach of lease unless I cooperated in removing the unauthorized tenant. I told him I understood and that I wanted to proceed. He said he'd have the notices prepared and posted within 24 hours. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I called her. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding slightly annoyed. She asked what was up, her tone casual like nothing was wrong. I told her I'd be home in 2 days as scheduled. She said okay. I asked her how things were at the apartment. She said fine, Everything was fine. I asked if anything new was happening. She paused, then said no, just the usual. I told her I'd see her soon and hung up. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying those camera recordings in my mind, kept thinking about how easily she'd lied to me on the phone. For years together, and she could lie without even a tremor in her voice. My flight home landed early afternoon. I took a cab from the airport directly to the apartment. When I walked up to the building, I noticed the notice immediately. It was posted on my door, a formal document on bright paper that was impossible to miss. I read it quickly. Unauthorized occupants had 48 hours to vacate the premises or face legal eviction proceedings. It was stamped and signed by the landlord with the date and time clearly marked. This had been posted 6 hours ago. I unlocked the door and went inside. The apartment was empty. I looked around and noticed signs of the other guy everywhere. Men's shoes by the door that weren't mine. A jacket on the coat rack I didn't recognize. The bathroom had an extra toothbrush, extra razor, men's body wash I'd never bought. The guest bedroom had clearly been unused. They'd been sharing my bed. I walked through each room cataloging everything, feeling numb. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That initial shock and hurt had crystallized into something colder, harder. I took photos of everything with my phone, documenting the evidence of occupancy. Around 6 that evening, I heard voices outside the door. Keys jingled, and the door opened. She walked in first, laughing at something, and then stopped dead when she saw me standing in the living room with my suitcase still beside me. The guy came in behind her, nearly bumping into her. He was younger than me, maybe late 20s, dressed in trendy clothes that probably cost more than I spent on an entire month's wardrobe. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, defiance. She recovered quickly and forced a smile. She said I was home early. I said I was right on schedule, actually. She glanced at the guy, then back at me. She introduced him using just his first name, saying he was a friend who'd been staying over. The guy gave me an awkward wave. I asked how long he'd been staying over. She said just a few days. I asked if she'd seen the notice on the door. Her expression tightened. She said she had, and that it was ridiculous. She said we were all adults and could handle this maturely. She said there was no reason to make a big deal out of the situation. She said we could work something out where everyone was comfortable. I felt something snap inside me. I told her very calmly that she was absolutely right. We were all adults. That's exactly why I'd handled this as an adult would, through the proper legal channels. I explained that the lease was solely in my name, that I was the only authorized tenant, and that by moving someone in without permission, she'd violated the lease terms. The notice wasn't ridiculous. It was a legal requirement. Her face flushed red. She started to argue that she lived here too, that she paid half the rent. I cut her off and reminded her that paying me money didn't make her a legal tenant. Her name appeared nowhere on any official document related to this apartment. She was essentially a guest who'd been allowed to stay, and now that permission was revoked. The guy finally spoke up, saying this seemed extreme. He said we should all just talk about it like reasonable people. I turned to him and told him he had no standing in this conversation whatsoever. He was a complete stranger who'd moved into an apartment he had no legal right to occupy. The notice applied to both of them. She exploded at that point. She said I was being vindictive and cruel. She said she'd just been trying to move on with her life. She accused me of being controlling and manipulative. The words poured out in a torrent, and I just stood there listening. When she finally ran out of steam, I asked her one question. Had she cheated on me? The silence that followed was deafening. She looked at the floor. She said things between us had been over for a while. I asked her to answer the question. She said we'd grown apart. I repeated the question. She finally admitted that yes, technically, maybe she'd started seeing him while we were still together, but it wasn't like I'd been emotionally available anyway. I nodded slowly. I told her the 48 hours started this morning at 9 a.m. when the notice was posted. That meant she had until 9 a.m. the day after tomorrow to have herself and her boyfriend completely moved out. I told her I'd be staying with my friend in the complex for those 2 days to give them space to pack. I also told her that if anything in the apartment was damaged or went missing, I'd be filing a police report and pursuing charges. She started crying then, saying she had nowhere to go that quickly. She said her parents lived 3 states away. She said I couldn't just throw her out on the street. I reminded her that she'd made her choices, and those choices had consequences. I told her that the boyfriend standing next to her presumably had his own place, or parents, or friends. Those were her problems to solve, not mine. The guy tried to argue that this was all a misunderstanding. He claimed he hadn't known the full situation. I told him I didn't care what he did or didn't know. I said the notice was legally binding, and if they weren't out in 48 hours, the landlord would pursue formal eviction, which would follow them both on background checks for years. I mentioned that might make finding their next apartment together quite difficult. I grabbed my suitcase, walked past them both, and left. I went to my friend's apartment, and he let me crash on his couch. He asked what happened, and I gave him the abbreviated version. He said I was handling it better than he would have. I wasn't sure about that. I felt like I was barely holding myself together. The next day and a half passed in a blur. I went to work and tried to focus on catching up from my trip. My phone blew up with texts from her. First angry, then pleading, then angry again. She said I was ruining her life. She said she'd never forgive me. She said I'd regret this. She said she was sorry, and could we please talk? She said her friends were all telling her I was abusive. She said the guy had dumped her and gone back to his ex-girlfriend because he didn't want the drama. She said I was a heartless bastard. She said she loved me, and we could work through this. I didn't respond to any of it. I'd said everything I needed to say. On the morning the deadline hit, I returned to the apartment at 9 a.m. exactly. The landlord met me there. We walked in together to find the place empty. She'd taken her stuff, her clothes, her books, her various belongings. She'd also taken some things that weren't hers. The TV was gone. The coffee maker was gone. Several of my books were missing. The expensive knife said I'd bought was nowhere to be found. I documented everything with photos and made a list. The landlord witnessed it all and made his own notes. He asked if I wanted to pursue charges. I said I'd think about it. Honestly, I just wanted to be done with the whole situation. The missing items totaled maybe $1,500. I could replace them. My peace of mind was worth more than dragging this out further. The landlord checked the apartment for damage. There were a few scuff marks on the walls, a broken towel rack in the bathroom, and a mysterious stain on the carpet in the bedroom. Nothing catastrophic. He said he'd have maintenance look at it and bill me for whatever exceeded normal wear and tear. I thanked him for handling everything professionally. After he left, I sat alone in the empty, quiet apartment. For years of my life had just evaporated. I'd thought we'd been building something together. I'd imagined proposing eventually, maybe buying a house, having kids. All of that had been a fantasy I'd constructed while she'd been planning her exit. The depression hit hard over the next few weeks. I went through the motions at work, but felt hollow inside. My friend checked on me regularly, dragged me out for dinner and drinks when I got too isolated. Slowly, very slowly, the fog started to lift. Update 1. It's been 3 months since everything went down. I'm writing this update because a few people from my building who knew what happened have asked me how things turned out, and honestly, writing it out helps me process. The first few weeks after she left were the worst. I kept expecting to see her around the complex, kept half listening for her key in the lock. The apartment felt enormous and empty despite being the same size it had always been. I'd come home from work and the silence would just crush me. I started leaving the TV on just for background noise. About 2 weeks after the eviction, she texted me one final time. She said she'd thought about everything and realized I'd been right to end things. She said she was sorry for how it all went down, and she was sorry for taking my stuff. She said she was crashing with a friend across town and trying to figure out her next steps. She asked if we could meet up to talk, not to get back together, just to get closure. I sat with that message for a long time. Part of me wanted that closure conversation. Part of me wanted to hear her explain in detail how she could throw away 4 years so casually. But the smarter part of me knew that conversation would just reopen wounds that were starting to scab over. I texted back that I thought it was better if we didn't meet. I told her I hoped she figured things out, but that I needed to move forward. I didn't hear from her again. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into my projects, volunteered for extra assignments, even took another trip to oversee an installation in Texas. My boss noticed the increased dedication and called me in for a conversation about it. He asked if everything was okay at home. I gave him the short version, and he nodded knowingly. He said he'd been through something similar years ago. He told me the best revenge was building a better life than I'd had before. Those words stuck with me. I started going to the gym again, something I'd let slide during the relationship. I signed up for a recreational basketball league through work. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected. One weekend, I drove out to my parents' place and spent 3 days just decomposing, eating my mom's cooking, and sitting on their back porch. They didn't push me to talk about it, which I appreciated. Sometimes you just need to exist in a space where people love you without requiring anything in return. The apartment slowly started feeling like mine again rather than ours. I rearranged the furniture. I replaced the TV with a newer model. I bought new sheets and towels because the old ones carried too many memories. I hung up some artwork I'd always liked but she'd thought was ugly. Small changes, but they mattered. Around the 2-month mark, I ran into my landlord in the parking lot. He asked how I was settling back in, and I said things were getting better. He mentioned he'd had to deal with 2 other similar situations in the complex over the years, relationships that went south where only one person was on the lease. He said I'd handled mine better than most. He also mentioned, casually, that he'd seen my ex with a moving truck a few weeks back loading stuff from a storage unit. Apparently, she'd gotten an apartment in a cheaper part of town. I thanked him for the update, but didn't ask for details. That chapter was closed. The stuff she stole still bothered me on principle. I decided not to press charges because, honestly, I just wanted to move on. But I did file a detailed report with the police documenting everything, just in case. The officer who took my statement said these kinds of petty theft cases rarely went anywhere unless the value was over a certain threshold, but having it on record could matter if there were future incidents. I signed the paperwork and filed it away, both literally and mentally. Dating felt impossible to even consider. A couple of coworkers had mentioned they knew someone they wanted to set me up with, and I'd politely declined every time. I wasn't ready. The idea of trusting someone else with that level of access to my life made my chest tight. Maybe eventually, but not yet. What helped the most was realizing how many red flags I'd ignored during the relationship. Little things that hadn't seemed important at the time, but in retrospect painted a clear picture. The way she'd always needed to be the center of attention. How she'd gotten angry when I'd spent time with friends without her. The subtle put-downs about my job or hobbies that I'd brushed off. The fact that she'd never wanted to discuss future plans beyond the next few months. I'd made excuses for all of it because I'd wanted it to work. One night, sitting alone with a beer and some takeout, I had a moment of clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was just relieved. Relieved that I'd found out who she really was before I'd proposed. Relieved that there were no kids involved, no shared property, no legal entanglements beyond the lease situation. Relieved that I could walk away relatively cleanly and rebuild on my own terms. Update 2. 6 months out now, and life looks completely different. I'm writing this final update because I want to close this chapter definitively, both for anyone following along and for my own sense of completion. The biggest change is internal. Somewhere along the way, I stopped defining myself in relation to that relationship. I wasn't the guy who got cheated on anymore. I was just myself again, but a stronger, clearer version. That shift happened gradually, then all at once. I got a promotion at work. My boss made good on his observation about my increased dedication and moved me into a senior account manager role with a significant salary bump. The extra money went straight into savings. I had no idea what I was saving for exactly, but having that financial cushion felt important after feeling so vulnerable. The apartment became truly mine. I adopted a dog from a local shelter, a 3-year-old mixed breed who'd been returned twice by previous owners. The shelter staff was upfront about his issues. He had anxiety, didn't like being alone, and needed consistent training. We were a perfect match. He gave me a reason to come home, to maintain a schedule, to get outside. Walking him every morning and evening created structure in my life that I hadn't realized I needed. I started dating, though very casually. Nothing serious. Just meeting people for coffee or dinner without expectations. It was strange at first, relearning how to make conversation, how to present myself, how to read signals. But it also felt like practice for eventually being ready for something real. I was upfront with everyone that I wasn't looking for a serious relationship, and most people appreciated the honesty. My friend from the complex, the one who'd let me crash on his couch and had first alerted me to what was happening, became even closer. We started a tradition of Sunday basketball followed by beers and whatever game was on TV. That simple, consistent friendship was healing in ways I hadn't expected. He never brought up the ex unless I did. Never pushed me to get over it faster, just existed as a steady presence. I found out through mutual acquaintances that my ex had moved in with yet another guy about 4 months after our split. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. See, this was who she was. This was a pattern. But mostly I just felt nothing. Her life and choices weren't my concern anymore. I hoped she'd eventually figure herself out, but whether she did or didn't had no bearing on my well-being. The thing about betrayal is that it teaches you what you won't tolerate. It clarifies your boundaries in sharp, unmistakable terms. I knew now that I'd never again let someone move into my space, literal or emotional, without clear commitment and trust built over time. I'd never again ignore red flags because I was afraid of being alone. I'd never again confuse the desire for a relationship with actually having a healthy one. Looking back at that moment when I stood in my apartment and told her and her boyfriend that they had 48 hours to leave, I felt proud of that guy. He'd been hurt, shocked, angry, but he'd kept his composure and handled it correctly. He'd protected himself legally and emotionally. He'd refused to be drawn into drama or manipulation. He'd enforced boundaries firmly and without apology. That was the person I wanted to keep being. The revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't in the eviction itself. That was just enforcing consequences for actions. The real revenge was building a life I genuinely enjoyed, one that wasn't built on the shaky foundation of someone else's half-hearted commitment. The revenge was becoming someone who wouldn't tolerate being treated that way ever again. The revenge was being okay. Last week, I signed a new lease for a different apartment in a better part of town. Fresh start, new space, no memories attached. My dog and I moved in 3 days ago. The place has more light, a better layout, and a small balcony where I have my coffee in the mornings. I'm furnishing it slowly, choosing pieces I actually like instead of compromising on every decision. I'm not entirely healed. I don't know if you ever are completely after something like that. But I'm functional, productive, and most days, genuinely happy. That's enough. That's more than enough, actually. It's everything.